Hello friends, in this video I will give you 5 tips on how to paint a watercolor magnolia using simple techniques and a bunch of other tips as well. I will also be talking about my first Skillshare class that will be released on the platform in December 2021 in just a few days. So let's get started. First stage of almost every watercolor painting is a sketch, and so I would like to talk about that for a moment. You can choose to skip this step and trace a photo or a sketch that's provided by a teacher in an online class. But I always encourage people to start creating their own sketches when they are learning how to paint. I think most of us choose to skip sketching because we either want to save time or because we are worried that when we don't have a proper drawing training, the sketch won't have the correct proportions and so on. I want to encourage you here, and this is why I love to teach watercolor techniques using flowers as a starting point. They are quite easy to sketch and it only takes a few minutes. And also flowers still look like flowers even if you don't get the proportions right 100% the first time. It boosts your confidence, your motivation to draw more, and even helps you being more intentional with the painting process. So there is a lot of benefit for you as an artist to grab that pencil and try to sketch the subject you are painting. In this case, the gorgeous magnolia flower. I always sketch the rough shapes first, and I imagine the subject as a simple geometric shape, which I will then break down into smaller simple geometric shapes. For example, those side petals look like triangles, and so I literally sketch a very loose triangular shape. In the last stage of drawing process, I only refine those shapes, add curves here and there, but always working on top of the large basic shape that I initially laid down. The important thing is to sketch on a separate sheet of paper so that you can erase your mistakes and correct as much as you like, and then transfer the sketch to the watercolor paper. I will now be using a simple graphite stick and cover the back of my sketching paper with it, then lay it down on a watercolor paper and go over the lines. You can also use tracing paper or charcoal paper, I think it's called, or a lead table, but this is, for me, it's the simplest method that you don't really need any extra materials. Don't forget to mount it to the board or your table with masking tape. Now, how to paint a watercolor magnolia. It's time for my 5 tips, and we're only going to be using simple watercolor techniques. First tip is to water down your paint. A lot of people don't know what this means when they are first starting with watercolor, especially when you get nice watercolors that are rich in pigmentation and they lift from the pens easily. You tend to grab lots of pigment and add some water to it. But try the opposite, add a pool of water to your palette and add just a bit of pigment. The consistency of your paint should be similar to tea. Don't worry that the watery paint won't stick to a place on your paper. It can't actually run freely when the paper is dry. For example, here I applied the watercolor paint to the entire magnolia silhouette and the wash is quite watery, but it won't escape the lines unless I make a mistake and wet the paper outside the lines. I actually made a video about painting wet on dry that explains this principle in detail, and if you're not familiar and want to learn more, I will have it listed in the description of this video. My second tip is to embrace the abstractions created by the nature of watercolor. Honestly, if you're not going to use them in any way in your works, you might as well try gouache or other mediums that give you 100% control over them. Watercolor is unpredictable, and lots of what it creates we consider mistakes, but I think the splatters and blooms can be utilized to create really appealing studies, and this works especially well with flowers. Here I am working on an underpainting and I added tons of water into it with the intention to create random blooms that have nothing to do with how the magnolia actually looks, but will make my study look more playful and unique. I'm not saying that you need to overdo this as much as I like to, but don't throw away your painting when an accidental mess happens somewhere. Try to work it out, make it part of composition, and this is how an individual art style can develop. Here's the third tip, and that is to keep an area wet enough for as long as possible. You can't correct watercolor much once it dries. And so the only way to really influence what's happening with the paint and how the colors bleed into one another is to keep it wet all the time and push the paint back and forth with your brush until the paint sits where you want. This looks complicated and hard, but it is not. And if you manage to add enough water with your first wash, then you can keep on correcting, adding, lifting and removing as you wish, and for quite long if you are using cotton paper, in fact. A good example is this large petal in front of my magnolia. I think I worked on it for about 10 minutes until I was satisfied with where the darker color ended up. But working wet in wet like this, I still consider an easier and quicker technique than gradually adding shadows in layers, which is more complicated and takes much longer. Fourth tip is to dry every area carefully and thoroughly before moving to the next. And that should help you avoid bleeding the paint from one petal to the next. This is quite a common problem. You tend to realize that you have a wet petal on your paper when it's like nicely shiny from the water that you just applied, and that means that you can't start painting the petal right next to it. But there is a tricky drying stage that every watercolor painting has, and I call it the false dry stage. What happens is that paint already appears matte, and so you assume that it's dry. You continue painting the next area, but in a few minutes you realize that paint bled out from the first area anyway, and that your painting needs a lot of fixing. What I do to ensure that the painting is really dry is to check if it's flat. In the false dry stage, painting appears dry on the surface, but the paper is still slightly buckled from being wet inside, and when you dry it with a hairdryer, it flattens nicely, assuming that you mounted it with a masking tape, of course. My fifth and last tip is to paint the shadows last. I always wait for when the flower study is almost finished and then paint last details and final touches. If you keep this for the very end, then you can paint them on top of all the color variations that the flower consists of that you already painted, and you can do it with one color mix, and so the shadows will look much more consistent and the study overall will look more polished and neat, in my opinion. And I do like to add splatters to decorate the paintings in the end. By the way, when learning to tackle the new medium, or if you are getting used to a specific subject like flower studies, it is so useful to paint a series of paintings or studies rather than one painting. I always cut 5 to 10 pieces of watercolor paper and put it on my table, and then just create studies until there is no paper left. Some will turn out great and others will be a mess, but that all is part of the process, and when you realize that it is not about a single painting that measures the progress that you've made, you'll get through with this with a smile and also have so much fun. And for people like you that love watercolor or would like to try it, I created a new class in collaboration with Skillshare. The class is called Introduction to Watercolor, Painting Magnolia Flowers Using Simple Techniques. And in this class we will not only create no less than 3 watercolor magnolia paintings together, but I walk you through art materials, color mixing, sketching process, and mainly individual stages of my entire painting process. There is also an important lesson that I added, which is fundamental watercolor techniques. And here I tried my best to orient this towards beginner painters, most of all, to help them not only start painting with watercolor, but to already feel comfortable with it by the end of this class. I want to invite you to join the class as one of my students. If you're not familiar with Skillshare yet, it is an online learning platform with thousands of classes, and it works as a monthly or yearly subscription that grants you access to all the classes, not just mine. However, if you're not yet a member and want to take my class for free, I have a link in the description of the video for a free trial that allows you to watch all the courses for the entire month. I really hope to see you there and love to review all your works that you create for this class. Being able to give you my feedback is a whole new world for me, and it means a lot. So thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you there. Bye!